Chapter 26 is called The West and the World. The primary focus of this chapter is the age of imperialism set in the late 19th century and early 20th century in Europe. But this chapter really builds primarily on the achievements of the Industrial Revolution that we've spent so much time looking at this year, which allowed Europe to be the dominant continent in the world at this time, politically and economically. This is one chapter as well that has a lot of long-term significance in terms of setting up the way the world is today and some of the modern difficulties and hostilities that we see between the West and the Middle East, between the West and Asia. A lot of that really comes to a head here in the late 19th century as Europeans really started to take over and dominate most of the world. Section 1, Industrialization in the World Economy. This section really talks about how the wealth, the national wealth of Europeans just increased dramatically beginning in the Industrial Revolution at the expense of really the rest of the world. Huge gaps emerge in national income levels between Europeans and everywhere else. A really lopsided situation. You want to look in your book at figure 26.1, which is a simple map that says the average income per person, and it compares Britain with other developed nations in the West versus what at that point they called the Third World, which was everybody else in the world, and you'll see really dramatic differences between the income of Western Europeans versus everybody else. The interesting thing is that most places in the world started out roughly at the same level in about 1750, but certainly by about 1900, the Europeans are far and away ahead of everywhere else in the world. Why was it like this? Explanations, people seeking theories on why it was such a lopsided situation. Well, the first theory is a liberal theory. Classical liberalism, laissez-faire, capitalism, which says that the reason Europeans were rich is because they invented the things and had businesses necessary to achieve that wealth. So basically, they worked harder, they deserve it. The second theory is a Marxist theory, which says that basically the Europeans stole their wealth from the rest of the world through military force, aggression, theft, and that they didn't earn or deserve any of it. You can see that has very socialist overtones to it. Section B, the world market. Again, main point is it just talks about how the world has grown in trade starting in the Industrial Revolution, really directed by Europeans. So in the year 1900, there was 25 times more trade than in 1800. A huge change. And in particular, as you can guess, it's the British who dominate world trade as they were the leaders in industry. The next talks about railroads and steam power and refrigerated ships. All three of those factors are coming into their more fullness, and they all promoted trade. Railroads in terms of the ability to move things, move goods and services, steam power with passengers and freight on ships, the steam engines, and then lastly with refrigerated ships, you have the ability to move food all over the world in ways that you could never do that before, and keeping it fresh. Two huge canals were built in the 19th century. The Suez and the Panama Canal were both completed. Suez Canal is between the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea in Egypt. And the Panama Canal, as you hopefully know, goes right through the middle of Panama and between North and South America and connects the two oceans of the world. So all of that really, really helps facilitate trade. The last point on this page is that Western investment, in terms of money from Europe going abroad to build things and pay for things, increased dramatically. By 1914, $40 billion from the West was being sent abroad to, mainly though, to other English-speaking areas like the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. Turn to page 2. Section C, the opening of China and Japan. So the Europeans had wanted to trade with the Chinese and Japanese for centuries, knowing that these two nations were filled with opportunity and resources and materials. And for many, many years, Chinese and Japanese governments resisted European presences in their countries. They simply did not want to do business with any Europeans. And when they did do business, they controlled these Europeans tremendously. They thought of Europeans as barbarians and foreigners, and they were very worried about what influence they might have in Chinese culture, particularly. Specifically in China, they would designate one city that all Europeans had to come to trade, and that was it. And it was the city of Canton, and that was the official trading port for all Europeans in China, primarily the British. One other little facet of this is that the British at this time started an opium trade in China where they were selling what we would consider to be a drug to Chinese people. It was very, very profitable. Once the Chinese government realized that this was essentially drug smuggling, drug trade in their nation, they resisted the British doing this, and the British fought them in a series of wars called the Opium Wars for the right to sell opium to Chinese people. The British, of course, win those wars quite dramatically. This resulted in what we call the Treaty of Nanking from 1842, where the British essentially had defeated portions of the Chinese army in these wars, and it establishes the British rule over the city of Hong Kong as essentially a little territory outside of England that the British totally administered as if it was part of England. They westernized it. It was just a little outpost of Britain far, far away, and this is where the hub of European activity switches to at that point. So the summary here is that essentially the British used military aggression to open China's markets up to trade. They threatened, and then through the series of victories in these wars, they actually succeeded in forcibly opening China to trade. Very similarly in Japan, with the United States, we sort of took the lead in opening up Japan to trade through a military man named Commodore Matthew Perry, who first went to Tokyo Bay in 1853 to try to do business with Japanese and force them to trade. We had a historical hostility. Japanese had a historical hostility toward Europeans, much like the Chinese practiced isolationism. But when Commodore Perry arrived in Tokyo Bay, he threatened to blow up the city of Tokyo unless we did business with them. So we opened the doors to trade by force, similar to the British in China. Section D, the Western penetration of Egypt, starts to talk about how Europeans begin to take over certain portions of countries that were not European, really for the first time in a modern way. Egypt, for the longest time, was ruled by a fellow named Muhammad Ali, much like the boxer, different guy, who was a Turkish guy that actually ruled in Egypt, and he modernized Egypt. That was sort of the early 19th century. And large numbers of Europeans began to be attracted to go live in Egypt, particularly British people. There was a lot of great history and culture in the ancient world in Egypt. It fascinated a lot of British scientists, particularly archaeologists. Another thing that, as we just mentioned, was the completion of the Suez Canal in 1869, and that was paid for by borrowing money from the French primarily. And so, that's one example of modernization or westernization. Very expensive. The city of Cairo was westernized, and streets and buildings and transportation networks, all that was put in, but they borrowed the money from Western Europeans. And Egypt basically went into bankruptcy in 1876 and could no longer pay the debts back to the British and the French, for the French particularly. And so as a sort of a response or a punishment, the British and French simply came in and took over Egypt. They repossessed it. So if you don't pay your payment on your car, someone's going to come and take it from you. And this is basically how Britain and France treated Egypt. They repossessed it in order to get the money back that they were owed. So this was a new thing. Europeans had always had economic relationships with other parts of the world, but had rarely run them politically. And this starts a pattern that's going to continue for about 60, 70 years moving forward. Of course, the Egyptians did not like being ruled by Western Europeans, and the Egyptian Nationalist Party is a political party that was filled with anti-Western people. And they held rallies and they protested and they demanded that the British and the French leave Egypt, and every time these were crushed, famously in 1882 there was one such incident. The British government directly ruled Egypt for the most part until 1956. So we're talking more than 70 years of direct foreign rule by a European power of a Middle Eastern nation. Go over to page 3. Changing topics a bit, still though dealing with interactions between Europeans and the rest of the world. Section 2 is the Great Migration. This is a section that deals with when all the people, many people in Europe left Europe and went to other parts of the world in the 19th century. Between 1800 and 1900, the population of Europe really more than doubled in size. And so at the same time, there's the influx of people through birth rates going up primarily. There's a big outflow of population too. So between 1815 and 1932, 60 million people left Europe. And this is the famous stuff that a lot of families in America come from, where the immigrants come from Ireland or Italy or Germany or England for that matter, and they land on Ellis Island in New York Harbor and establish a new life here for mainly economic reasons. So why are people coming? Well, economics, number one. Not enough land in Europe, not enough farms, not enough jobs. Typical stuff. Economics motivates people to make drastic changes in their life. So the patterns that you see in immigration from Europe to the rest of the world is there's a huge increase right before World War I, as there was a big period of migration leading up to the war. And then once the war hit, it sort of slowed down. Not all countries sent immigrants to the same place, and not all immigrants came to the United States. Immigrants from Europe went to Russia, Canada, Argentina, Brazil, Australia, New Zealand. We just think of all immigrants as sort of coming to our shores in history, but they were actually headed many places. So who's the typical migrant in 19th century, or someone leaving Europe in the 19th century? Well, small farmers and skilled artists, people with a skill or a trade, not the unskilled, not the urban poor, people that are ready to work. They're young, they're not old, they're not really impoverished. They just need opportunity and they know how to work in some area. In fact, some people would go and work abroad and then actually come back to Europe and bring their money with them and return to their families. They were almost temporary workers that would go and come back. And they'd want to buy land back in Europe if they had enough money that they made somewhere else. The one exception to this was Jews. When Jews left, they never really came back to Europe because of the rising anti-Semitism that we talked about in chapter 25. Once a Jewish person left, they were very unlikely to ever come back to Western Europe again. There's lots of case studies in this chapter of immigrants, and they mention one here on Italian immigrants particularly. A lot of Italian immigration happens in the late 19th century to South America, the United States, New York particularly, also France. Agricultural reasons. People were running out of farms and running out of land, and they needed to work and make a living, so they went somewhere else to do that. And these migration chains, that's a term they mention here, where basically there's a connection between the old country and the settlement in wherever they ended up. And so an initial group of people will move, let's say, to New York from Italy and establish a small community there. And then people would hear about that back home, and they would follow that person or that community over into the North American areas or New York or whatever. And so there would be these chains of ethnic ties between new and old, and entirely new neighborhoods would form in New York or Boston, centered around one ethnic group, where all the people there really bonded to one another, and they didn't really integrate with other folks, and they had connections back to the homeland. They sent money back to the homeland. It was like they'd transplanted their little life from southern Italy into New York. Section C, about Asian migrants. 3 million Asians left in the late 19th century. A lot of them came to South America, some to Africa, actually. And then in the West to Cuba, Peru, Australia, even Hawaii, and the future United States there. And a lot of Asian immigrants went to be laborers, to do very, very low level work for low wages, really, and they served the role in replacing black slaves, which once obviously slavery was illegal in our country after the Civil War. There was a demand for labor, and Asian migrants served some of that demand. There was so much immigration from Asian nations that to the West that European settlers in North America, for example, demanded that be limited, that there only so many Asian immigrants could come in per year. There was lots of reasons for this. One, that there was some racial stuff. Most Europeans didn't believe the Chinese would ever fit into a white culture or a European culture. There wasn't a lot of assimilation. Also, jobs were being taken up for lower wages. Some economic, racial, political. And so these European settlers demanded what were called Great White Walls, which were limits on the number of immigrants that were allowed to enter from Asia. And they also wanted to encourage more white people to immigrate from Europe, at the same time fewer coming from Asia. Turn over to page 4. Section 3 is really the meat of this chapter, the most important part. The Western imperialism, this is where we're headed. This is when Europeans again go out and basically take over big chunks of the world. We define some terms here. Old imperialism from really the 1500s up to about 1840, 1850 is really when Europeans established just economic relationships, trading relationships, even slave trade relationships with other parts of the world. New imperialism, starting in about 1850 and moving on, will be known for when Europeans just simply take over the political situation, the political structure, and the economic structure of these nations and other parts of the world. B, the scramble for Africa. You really want to look at map 26.2. You want to study that. That's a really critical map. It's going to lay out which European countries took over Africa primarily. This is on page 870 in your text. You want to know the trends and where each European nation focused their efforts. So it's a really critical map. They give you some sort of high points here in the text reading. So for example, the British were all over Africa. One of the places they went and wanted to take over was the southern tip of Africa for obvious trade and economic reasons. But the Dutch had gone there first. The Dutch were there. They were known as the Boers, the Dutch settlers, original Dutch settlers, also known as Afrikaners. And so you have conflict right away between white Europeans fighting other white Europeans for rule over certain parts of Africa. But then between 1880 and 1900, 20 years, Europeans took over almost all of the continent of Africa, with only 2 exceptions, Ethiopia and Liberia, as you can see on your map. Some of these Europeans were quite famous. A very famous guy named Cecil Rhodes, sort of a freelance colonialist, very famous guy, goes down and really he's the founder of the De Beers Diamond Company. So he ruled as a European colonialist, took over and ruled lots of southern Africa. Very famous guy. He was sort of larger-than-life character. He was gay, which was very unusual for that time to be so famous. So there's a little biography of him on page 873 that I think is worth a read. Talks about his mixed legacy in African history and some of the good things he did and also some of the negative things he did as well. Again, back to this conflict between British and Dutch settlers in South Africa. There's a war known as the Boer War, where the Dutch, are known as the Boers, fight the British, or who's going to run South Africa. The British win that war, but eventually the Dutch sort of reestablish their own political power, and that legacy is going to go all the way up to the 1990s, when the white government of South Africa finally decided to share power with actual Africans, black Africans, and that's where someone like Nelson Mandela fits in prominently. Some other key people in the story: Leopold II of Belgium was the king of Belgium, and he went and established the Belgian Congo, one of the most famous colonies there. He ruled it personally as the personal king of that area. He sent Henry M. Stanley, who was a famous explorer, to sort of chart out this new unknown land of the Congo. Very interesting stuff in this chapter. Really important conference was held in 1884 in Berlin called the Berlin Conference, and it was really to prevent conflict among Europeans as they decided who was going to take over parts of Africa. It was initiated by Jules Ferry of France and Bismarck of Germany, and they wanted to set the ground rules for colonialization so that Europeans didn't end up fighting each other. They would work together to take over somebody else. They required what was called effective occupation in order to establish a colony, which means you actually had to have the country under your physical control. You had to have boots on the ground in these African nations in order to call it your own colony as a European. They wanted to stop the slave trade. Actually, that's one positive thing they were talking about at the Berlin Conference. But really, this is all about how to cut that African cake, was the phrase they used at the time. How to cut the magnificent African cake so that Europeans wouldn't destroy each other in the taking of it. This was really important because Germany is now a colonial power. After 1870, they're a force to be reckoned with in Europe, and they wanted to say in the colonial game. They were behind, so to speak, and they wanted to get a piece of the pie here before it was all gone. Again, the Germans very prominent in this process. On to page 5. Lots of African nations resisted. One time, only one really, at Khartoum in 1885, the British suffered a loss in Sudan at the hand of natives there, basically. It was very rare. For the most part, battles between Europeans and Africans went like at Omdurman, where the British just would massacre people with machine guns, 11,000 Africans killed versus only 28 British. That's more typical, completely outmanned and outgunned. Section C, I really want you to look at map 26.3 about imperialism in Asia, but that kind of goes outside the scope of our class a little bit more. Just know that there were many European nations and they were making colonies all over Asia, setting up lots of future conflicts like the Vietnam War as the French ruled that. The main causes of new imperialism in the 19th century, number one is economics. The search for markets, the effort to be better at a bigger economy in the homeland of Europe than someone else. Industrial technology needed markets to sell, resources to come in, turn those into finished products and sell them back on the world market. There's a political motive as well. International prestige is on the line for Europeans. People believed that it was necessary to have colonies to be a great nation. This was part of nationalism at the time. Social Darwinism is a theory, remember that, where there are certain groups of people that are more advanced and superior than others, and it's their right to rule the world and to rule the less intelligent, as they thought at the time, and less modern. These are racial theories, cultural theories. Henrik von Treitschke of Germany was really into that theory. So again, that's sort of a brutal way to look at humanity, a survival of the fittest mentality. Technology is huge. Machine guns are invented at this point and go all over in Europeans' hands. Europeans discover a cure or really a prevention for getting the disease malaria. If you take what's known as quinine, you won't get malaria, which is in Africa, and that had killed Europeans in the past, and now Europeans don't die when they go down there as much. Transportation and communication had grown significantly with the railroads and shipping and effectively moving people on boats all around the world. And then the last page really is number 6. Reason number 5, social tension and domestic political conflicts. Basically, European governments taking colonies to distract people at home from what's really going on there and diverting attention away from the lack of liberty or liberalism or voting rights or economic advancement. You could be proud of your country for taking a colony and forget the fact that you don't have a job, let's say, back in France or in Germany. Special interest groups are important. Shipping industry, shipping companies, missionaries, military leaders all stood to gain through colonial advancement. Number 7, maybe lastly, maybe more importantly, the belief that Europeans were civilizing the world, most famously embodied in Rudyard Kipling's poem White Man's Burden, which I really want you to read. That is on page 875. Just take a look at that poem. It sort of captures the attitude of most Europeans in bringing culture, civilization to the unenlightened world. And then a religious motive, really should be number 8, spreading of Christianity. Don't forget that. There's missionaries that go everywhere as part of imperialism, establishing Christian churches in Asia, Africa, primarily in Africa, but really everywhere in the world. So lots of reasons why imperialism really happened when it did. Not everyone in Europe believed in imperialism. In fact, many people really vehemently opposed it. You see several critics of that in literature and in philosophy here. English economist J.A. Hobson was essentially a socialist and said that imperialism is really only the result of unregulated capitalism, its exploitation. It only benefits special interest groups. Very scathing critique of what he saw around him. He was, certainly not part of that process himself. Another critic was Henry Labouchere, who basically called out white Europeans as racist bullies and wrote little poems and sayings along those lines. Novels at the time talked about the degeneration of Western Europeans into savages as they went and took colonies. This book, Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, is along those same lines, where basically the main character of that book was a liberal European scholar, and he went down into Africa and he became a savage. So that parallels what Conrad thought of the nations as a whole, which were becoming savage nations as opposed to enlightened nations. Great book, really worth a read. They used to read that I think they still read that in English 11 or 12 at our school, so you have that in your future. And then lastly, people pointed to the existence of a double standard, how Europeans demanded liberalism at home. They demanded political rights and freedom of speech and assembly and First Amendment type things and representation in parliaments and constitutions. And those were now the standard demands of a European in the late 19th century, and they were getting them. But abroad in the rest of the world, as Europeans really took it over, they did none of those same things. So expectations for something at home that they certainly did not practice abroad.